So EJ, I would just say about the order of speakers, at the age 61, I'm still learning things, but even I know B.B. King is always the final act.
This is the most multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic gathering in the South.
They said we have power, we're going to engage in political tyranny, and this legislature has had a propensity to pass laws that the courts of this state, didn't even have to get to the federal court, the courts of this state overturned. So we have the moral high ground. They're the ones that should be questioned.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Dr. Barber will speak to you.
I'm afraid Dr. Barber needs to get in my office so we can set up an appointment.
No.
All we need to do is just be respectful towards each other.
Forward together, not one step back. Not one step back. When blacks and progressive whites came together 144 years ago to begin the long journey out of the divisions of the Civil War, the good of the whole was their vision and their dream for this state. They knew then what we must know now. It's the only way forward. It's the better way.
The battle today is not between the Democrats and the Republicans. It is between those who believe in a philosophy of greed and selfishness and those who believe in the morality of caring for those in need.
Now is the time to take a stand for justice throughout this land.
The policies of Tom Tillis, Phil Berger, and Pat McCrory are harming my patients grievously.
There are constitutional rights that must be supported in this state.
A state that knows how to be progressive. A state that knows how to lift up.
Our governor and legislators are trying to steal our birthright as citizens. But together we say you cannot have our state.
An attack on voting rights is an attack on the soul of our democracy.
But there's nothing wrong with North Carolina that a good dose of people power cannot fix.
I'm a teacher. I drove 6 hours this morning. I was so depressed when I heard what this legislature thinks of me. But I came last week and I was inspired. And I'll come as often as I need to.
We will stand up again, we will march again, we will preach again, we will organize again. We are black, we are white, we are Latino, we are Native American, we are Democrat, we are Republican, we are independent, we are people of faith, we are people not of faith, we are natives and immigrants, we are business leaders and workers and unemployed, we are doctors and the uninsured, we are gay, we are straight, we are students, we are parents, we are retirees. We are North Carolina. We are America. And we're here and we ain't going nowhere.
Our collective hope is that we'll continue to build a movement that affects this state but has implications for this nation.
You feed the hungry! You love justice!
These provisions, individually and collectively, will result in less opportunity for African Americans to vote, to have their votes counted, and to elect candidates of their choice.
We're here as educators today, as professionals, as people, saying enough.
But if you don't have Medicaid, 2,800 people gonna die.
Medicaid, I would die.
You would die, right? And that's what this is about. And I keep this not about just merely debating. They say, well, let's have a friendly debate. This is about death and life.
I have cervical cancer. I don't have Medicaid. And I'm only getting sicker.
It's a real human being, a mother of 2 children, who's denied. Why? We pay federal taxes. The money is there. There's no cost to the taxpayers in North Carolina. There's not a penny coming out of this legislature. But we're going to deny her access to health care, access to life. That's not right. It's not right.
Today, and only today, we will put that tape over their mouth, not because we are complicit with their rules, but because we are defying their rules, and we want to show the whole world how crazy it is to try to shut down democracy and shut down the voice of the people.
I'm 78 years old. I've been a revolutionary most of my life.
Fired up! Ready to go! Fired up! Ready to go! This is the 7th day of the Jericho March.
Nobody out! Everybody in! Nobody out! Everybody in!
That's correct. And so it's important for us to do all that we can to get as many people out to vote as we possibly can.
I still believe there's a God can take out a stony heart and put it in a heart of flesh. I still believe there's a power that can change the leper spots. And that's why I think we ought to sing in this movement. Revive us again. Fill each heart with thy love. May each soul be rekindled with some fire from above. Hallelujah! Thine the glory. Hallelujah! Thine the glory. Hallelujah! Thine the glory. Revive us again.
Let me thank you for allowing us to be here, allowing me to be here, and I say us because back in the Forward Together Moral movement, we have a phrase that we is the most important word in the justice vocabulary. The issue is not what I can do, but we can do when we pray together, stand together, mobilize together, litigate together, and most of all, stay together. Let me thank the Albert Shanker Institute, Leo, for this invitation, and you have given me two of my kind of life dreams. The first one was to get close enough to Mary Wright Edelman to hug her, and I've been waiting 31 years, long time. I've been waiting a long time. I'm 51 years old. I read her so much in college, and she doesn't know she was such an inspiration to me when I was in school via her readings and her quotes. And then to come here and hear a Washington Post editor start off with scripture. That's a pretty, Moral Monday is working somewhere. But I thank you, EJ, for all that you do and how I was ready to go after you finished, really, for stirring us and reminding us, because I don't think there can be today or any time a separation from the academy and activists. I think we have to keep it all tied together. What I want today, and it's interesting how, Brother Dion, we are channeling each other, because I wanted to start in the same place that you started, because I'm always thinking that part of our work in the public square is to take back what persons who call themselves ultra this or ultra that, ultra conservative, have taken. I think we have, first of all, to recapture linguistically the language of democracy. You know, when some of these, I always stutter at this point because I do not like the phrase conservative and liberal. And I'm waiting when we can get out of that framework, because I think it has locked us into a place. Because I don't know how people call themselves conservative who keep wanting to undermine the fundamental values of our Constitution. To conserve means to hold on to the essence of. I don't know why we continue to use language from the French Revolution to describe our reality in America, left versus right. I linguistically have a problem calling somebody right that I think is so wrong. And you know, in the French Revolution, the right were the ones on the side who wanted to keep the king, and the left were the other side. And so I'm really pushing that we do need to be more constitutional in our language, more faith-based, more moral in our language, not just for others, but to liberate ourselves. And so I too want to start with that language. And though the framers had some moral, political deficiencies, surely, but as Thurgood Marshall suggested one time, one of the best things about our Constitution is that it could be amended. And they did say, however, and I don't believe they alone were writing this. I believe there was a greater power at work somewhere for you to say in the 1700s, we the people of the United States in order for a more perfect union. That's a confession, y'all. That's what we would call that in church. I'm confessing I'm not perfect, and I have somewhere that I need to move to. And then what is interesting to me is that when we have many of our political people running for office politically, notice how many times they say freedom, particularly on certain parts of the aisle. Freedom, 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 freedom. And everybody's saying freedom. Why are you running freedom? Why are you against health care? Freedom. Why are you against taxes? Freedom. Why are you for taxes? Freedom, freedom, freedom. And what's interesting to me is that is not the first word in our Constitution. There is no concept of this kind of benign freedom. It is a qualified freedom that must begin with establishment of justice. And then there must be an insurance of domestic tranquility. And then there must be provisions for the common defense. And then there must be not merely a wanting welfare, but an actual promoting, active promoting of the general welfare of all people. And then our Constitution suggests you might be able to pass on the blessings of liberty to your posterity. But there is no way you can just say freedom without it being qualified. There's a little book out now that actually says the only kind of capitalism that is approved in our Constitution is human rights capitalism. That if, in fact, our policies do not establish justice and promote welfare, promote the general welfare, then they are actually out of bounds with the vision of our Constitution. Now, having read that, I want to suggest today, Leo, this, that defending the public square is a moral assertion, not just a political one. Even though I do believe politics are moral, I believe economics is a moral issue, health care is a moral issue, and I think part of our problem is that we have moved away from understanding issues from this perspective. But to suggest that we need to defend the public square is a moral assertion. And because of that, I want to suggest that moral dissenters are a necessity for this democracy. They're not just, moral dissenters are not something that can come and go. The very necessity, the very life of our democracy depends on moral dissenters. If we are going to ever move and continue to move toward a more perfect union, or what the Constitution in North Carolina says when they rewrote it right after slavery, all political power is vested in and comes from the people and should only be used for the good of the whole. That's what black and white people did in the South, in North Carolina, for instance, right after slavery, when they chose to rewrite the Constitution. It's interestingly the kind of language that they used, I'm going to talk about in a minute, those fusionists, language that they used and they inserted in the Constitution. Isn't it interesting that in the beginning of our Constitution, Dion, there's no mention of elected officials, elected political holders? The only group that is mentioned as key to the perfecting of this nation are the endowed people. You know, that one that the Declaration of Independence at first meant, who are inalienable, endowed. Certain people are endowed with inalienable rights. Moral dissenters. That's what William Lloyd Garrison was. One writer talks about how he was rescued from what was called a pro-slavery mob, not in Mississippi, not in Alabama, not in Georgia, but in Boston. He was arrested by a pro-slavery mob in Boston. That's why I tell my northern friends, don't ever think this race thing hadn't spread all over this country. But Lloyd Garrison wrote on the wall of his cell as a moral dissenter. He said, William Lloyd Garrison was put into this cell Wednesday afternoon, October 21st, 1835, to save him from the violence of a respectable and influential mob. who sought to destroy him for preaching the abominable and dangerous doctrine that all men are created equal. The reality is, always and everywhere, we have needed moral dissenters if this democracy is ever going to have a chance. And so, yes, part of my goal here, if you're not already baptized into the ministry of moral dissent, is to ensure that that happens. We'll have an altar call at the end. In fact, before I go any further, Leo, I accepted this invitation for another reason, and that is we are in North Carolina making a Selma call, a Selma. Remember Dr. King, they tried in Selma, and then there came a point he said, if you believe concerned about the state of American voting rights, then you need to come to Selma. Well, North Carolina is your Selma today. Let me tell you why. North Carolina has the first and the worst case after the Shelby decision. It will set the tone of how we deal with voting rights for the next 20 years. And I just came out of 9 hours of depositions yesterday where they were trying to do everything they could trip me up on this case as president of NAACP. Left my home this morning where one of my mothers in my church son passed at 48 years old, visiting them, and drove here. And my point is, there's so much going on personally and politically, but in terms of voting rights, North Carolina passed the first and the worst voting rights. Okay, and I'm glad media here, stop calling it a voter ID bill. It is not a voter ID bill. It is 40 changes in the election law, the worst thing we have seen since Jim Crow. And when they signed it, the governor signed it in less than 46 and a half minutes, we filed our suit. And when we go to trial, July 6th of this summer, which is exactly 30 days to the date that the Voting Rights Act was signed in 1965. I said this when I was in Selma, that we couldn't afford for Selma to be a celebration. Because when we walked across that bridge this year, we had less rights than they had won 50 years ago. And we even have proposals being suggested by certain Washington people that don't come down to South and talk to us. I'm not against Washington. You know, they proposed this Sensenbrenner bill. And I've asked people, have you read that bill? Do you realize that if the Sensenbrenner bill, and it doesn't matter who signed on to it, was to be passed, if the Tea Party and the extremists in Congress had said, okay, let's do this to appease us and to say they supported civil voting rights, do you realize that Alabama wouldn't even be covered under the formula in the Sensenbrenner bill? Think about that. Selma wouldn't be covered. North Carolina wouldn't be covered. Florida wouldn't be covered. Tennessee wouldn't be covered. Virginia wouldn't be covered. New York wouldn't be covered. Mississippi would only be covered about a year. And I had people in the so-called progressive community saying, Reverend Barber, shh, because we've just got to get something done. No. That is not what has made this democracy great. People who just agree to get something done for a photo op. It has always required moral dissenters who believed in something greater, believed that some things didn't just need to be augmented, they needed to be undone. I told somebody one day, I won't say to y'all who I said it to, but I was a little, sometimes my sugar gets a little low and I say some things that I probably wouldn't say if I had eaten a nab. And I was around some people, Sister Edelman, that always want to negotiate other people's pain. And say, well, you know, just if we just change a little bit, they want to take we and mean and augment it and mean not really we, just some of we. But there had to be some moral dissenters that said, no, we means we. And so I had to tell some folk, some of them that look like me, you know, they said, well, we're negotiating the best we can. I said, well, you know what? Folk in 1965 faced dogs, they faced death, and they faced destruction. And yet they held on to their values. I said, I'm scared for some folk to negotiate for me, because if I was in slavery and you were negotiating, you would negotiate simply a long weekend off. and not the abolition of slavery itself. Moral dissenters. You remember Henry David Thoreau, protesting the war with Mexico, refused to pay a poll tax because in good conscience he could not support an imperialistic document. And he wrote his book on resistance and civil government and said, when there is an unjust law, like the laws legalizing the institution of slavery, then it is the duty of every just man. You hush your mouth. It's the duty of every just man. To talk to this, come do that for me. To, in fact, break that law. And you remember the story that talks about Ralph Waldo Emerson visiting Henry David Thoreau and basically saying, Henry, why would a respectable guy like you be in jail? What are you doing in jail? And Henry looked at his friend and said, what are you doing not in jail? Considering all of the injustices that are going on in this time. You remember the moral dissent of Frederick Douglass. He did not play, and this was before the Civil War, that July 4th, he stood flat-footed with all of the risk and said that any attempt to celebrate the 4th of July Independence Day without dealing with the slavery, the sons and daughters of slaves, is nothing but fraud, bombast, and hypocrisy. Didn't negotiate that. You remember there was one justice in the 1896 Supreme Court, the Supreme Court that began in the 1880s to roll back all of the successes of Reconstruction. It was one justice, Justice Harlan. I love his name, the great dissenter. Great dissenter. By himself, alone, stood up. Remember what he said when Plessy versus Ferguson was passed? He says, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class. I said, you know what that could have cost him, and did cost him. He said, there is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerate classes among its citizens. This is after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And he becomes the dissenter. And most people, and that's why today we have to get out of this role of evaluating victory just along electoral lines. Sometimes we're going to have electoral victories, but you have to have moral victories long before you have electoral victories, because Harlan didn't win, but his dissent and what he wrote became the basis for which Charles Hamilton Houston began to build the cases, and then later on Thurgood Marshall was able to litigate. Without the dissenter, there would have been no foundation to transform the democracy. Or remember Elizabeth Canton's statement when she said, the history of the past is one long struggle toward equality. Remember that? Or Dr. King, when so-called liberal, I guess, I struggle with that term, but good ministers, some white down in Birmingham, questioned why he was there. Now these weren't the ministers who were anti the movement. These were the ministers who just said, yeah, but Doc, we can work this out. You don't have to do all this marching. These were the ministers like some in his own denomination that put him out and forced him and Gardner Taylor and others to found the progressive God Rest Gardner Taylor Soul. And Dr. King had to say, wait a minute, you don't understand the public square. I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. I'm in Birmingham because conscience requires that I be here. I'm here because we must fight to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Or finally, the day, remember when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg sounded like a prophet and not a Supreme Court justice? You remember it was a day that'll go down in infamy, June 25th, 2013, the day that they gutted Shelby, 5-4. And Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had written her dissent. And she actually signaled for us the fight. She says, she looked at this Supreme Court, those justices, and she said, hubris. Hubris is a fit word for today's demolition of the Voting Rights Act, throwing out pre-clearance Section 4 formula when it has worked, and continuing to work to stop discrimination is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And then she said, to the Supreme Court, almost like one of the great, she sounded like Deborah in the Bible. She didn't sound like a Supreme Court judge. She started sounding like Deborah, the great judge of ancient Israel. And she looked at them and said, don't forget Bloody Sunday. You know, and what she's saying, coded, can I unpack what she was saying since she was speaking in tongues just a little bit? And this is Pentecost. What she was saying is, don't think you're that Supreme Court. She was saying, you may have won this vote, but you've not ultimately won. And then she closed with that universalist quote that Dr. King also used. She said, because the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And you know, as a preacher, I must tell you, this history of defending the public square and the necessity of the public square for a nation is not just in our democracy, in the stories of our democracy, but it's in the stories of our faith, our religious tradition. Ask the Jewish brothers and sisters, what was the primary role of the prophets? The primary role of the prophets were to rise. They didn't just rise up. They only arose when the kings and the priests were not doing right in the public square. That's the only time the prophets arose. And when they arose with language like this. Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. Or they arose with language like this, cry loud and spare not, and show the nation their sins and how they exploit workers and they harm the poor. Or Jesus, that good Jew who became the founder of Christianity, you know him, Jesus? Yeah. Remember when he gave his speech, his final sermon, his last sermon, and he was talking about helping. He like Dion did, he didn't frame it in terms of charity. He framed it in terms of transformation. He says, the day will come when God will talk to the nations, not individuals. Never said he's going to talk to you about, did you feed the hungry? He says, I'm going to talk to the nations and say to the nations, when I was hungry, did you feed me? Nations, government, when I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was in prison, did you see about me? And then he says, now, inasmuch as the nations, not individuals, as the nations do unto the least of these, then you will have done it unto me. And he says, and that's how nations will be separated ultimately in the defined economy of how things are finally looked at. And so that's why I often tell some of the people who want to go around talking about they want a biblical discussion, I said, bring it on. Because there are 2,000 scriptures just in the Judeo-Christian holy book. There are 2,000 scriptures that speak to the issue of justice and how you treat those on the margin and how you treat women and how you treat children and how you treat the stranger. There are only about 4, maybe 5 scriptures that even speak to the issues that the so-called religious right, I call them religious extremists, pick up. It's only about 4 or 5 scriptures. They misinterpret at least 3 or 4 of those, and none of the scriptures that they use to attempt to codify hate and discrimination in our laws trump this scripture: you must love your neighbor as yourself. So moral dissenters are critical to this democracy, and defending the public square is a moral necessity. Would you say that with me? Moral necessity. Say that, just say that, moral necessity. Somebody must stand up and say, it doesn't matter what political party is in power. We must raise our dissent, knowing that whether we are heard now or later, history has shown that moral dissent in the public square sows the seeds of change and justice that eventually blossom on the landscape of our democracy. We must raise our moral dissent, and every generation has a calling to do it. Martin's not here, and I declare, I went down to the King Center, stood by the grave, called his name. They didn't get up. Elizabeth Canton State, not here. Frederick, not here, but their children are here, and their children's children are here. And we must have a society that articulates the connection between the moral call for justice and the common call for the common good. Do you realize when we talk about, one of the things I think that's missing is when we talk about all of the great movements, whether it's the abolition movement, whether it's the reconstruction movements, whether it's the Social Security, whether it's the fight for labor rights, sometimes we tend to forget, and sometimes I think progressives are shell-shocked from all of the extremism that we've just thrown away our moral conversation. We fail to remember not one of those things that bettered America, that moved America toward a more perfect union, happened without a moral framing. I didn't say not necessarily a Christian framing. I'm not talking about just not a deep moral framing that grew out of our deepest constitutional values and our deepest religious values. And we have to recover that connection, because the greatest myth of our time is that extremist policies harm a small subset of people. That's the greatest myth. We do this, it's only going to harm gay people. It's only going to harm certain women. It's only going to harm black people. And the reality is, extremism harms us all. Dissenters help destroy the myth of delusion and domination. They help us destroy those myths. But myths, you know, are powerful. And that is why you have to have a language that allows people sometimes who have been captivated by those myths to hear you before they dismiss you. Which is why if you just use the language of Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative, then some people can't even hear you. In moral language, Isaiah 50 says it like this: Lord, open my ear every morning that I might develop the tongue of the learned and know how to speak to those who are in trouble. There's a political economist from the University of Maryland, and he said in an article called America Beyond Capitalism, now he's not writing a communist document, so he's just talking about capitalism and what we have to recognize is going on. And listen what he says. He says, what we are really beginning, and listen at the moral conclusions in here, what we're really beginning to experience is a process of slow decay, punctuated by a recurring economic crisis, one in which reforms achieve only sporadic gains, but the long-term trends of growing inequality, economic dislocation, failing democratic accountability, deepening poverty, ecological degradation, greater invasions of liberty, and growing imprisonment, especially of minorities, continues to slowly and quietly challenge the belief in the capacities of our system and the integrity of our system. Otto Schwammer, up at MIT, I was studying, Jerry somehow got me up there, I don't know how all that happened, and blame everything on Jerry. And but in the class, Otto Schwammer came in one day and said, I want to talk to you all about economics. You know, this is MIT. I didn't, you know, I mean, I love MIT, but I didn't expect to hear an economist become a prophet. And he says, the problem with our economic system today is there's a blind spot in it called consciousness. I said, what did he just say? He said, consciousness. That's the blind spot. He said, the failure to recognize that we're all interrelated. He said, then he went on to channel Coretta Scott King. You remember when Coretta Scott King was asked one time about violence because of the killing of her husband, and she said, but violence is deeper than, I mean, yes, Martin was shot, but violence is also keeping children in the ghetto. Violence is undermining worker rights. Violence is keeping people making less than a minimum living wage. Violence is also when you deny people public education and undermine their culture. And then she said there's also another form of violence, and that is an apathetic life that refuses to engage. That too is violence. And so then Otto Schwammer, channeling her, I don't even know if he knew that quote, he says, in today's economic theory, we have a blind spot called consciousness, and because of it, we pass policies that every day engage in attention violence against the poor. Attention violence. We don't even acknowledge them, and our best and our brightest get caught up in that. Our best and our bright, our unions get caught up in it. Sometimes people we might support because they're progressive ideas. Our president, even sometimes trying to do the right thing, gets caught up in it. Listen, Today we are passing a policy, and we want support on this policy to try to move persons who desire to be in the middle class. Some folk haven't even gotten to desiring to be in the middle class. They are trying to simply save what Jesus rode into Jerusalem on. It rhymes with middle class. That's exactly what's going on. They're poor or po, and they did not experience recession in 2007 and 2008. They've been a part of the silent depression since 68, 69, 70, and on, 30 years that the major news networks do not talk about until it starts hurting the middle class and the upper class. And otherwise, poverty and the extremists force progressives almost to stop using the word. And when they force you to stop using the word, they were actually stealing the public square. Because the one thing you ought to be able to do in the public square is speak truth. And the moment you waver on that and back up from it, you are giving away that right, which then undermines the ability for us to promote a more perfect union. Let me move on. Many of us believe, and I've been pushing this idea around, Jerry. I don't know, you probably heard me talk about it 30 times, and I'm going to keep on till I get it right. I believe that we are on the threshold, possibly, of a third Reconstruction. I believe all of this social struggle we see are birth pains. I believe that God has allowed, I did all my heart, has allowed some of you all with gray hairs to hang around here, to hook up with some of us that don't have them, to then hook up with some of this younger crowd. Because I believe, in my heart I believe this, that we are in the birth pains of a possible third Reconstruction. And the difference is this time, those who are the descendants of those who have deconstructed every Reconstruction see it coming. And they are actually doing what they claim they are against. They are trying to abort it. Remember the first Reconstruction? It was built by multiracial Southern fusion movement. Black and white people came together after the Civil Rights, after the Civil War. And by 1868, 1872, they had rewritten almost every constitution in the South. Every state in the South was either led by a black majority political alliance or a mixed political alliance of fusionists. And remember what their goals were. Public education is a right. Health care. Fair labor laws, or fairer labor laws, that contradicted the hundreds of years of slavery. Fair tax policies. Fair criminal justice system. Voting rights. And it was working. It was working. And then around 1872, you get the founding of the Klan as a political organization, not first to come after black people, but to turn white people away. Not black people. And then you get first a slow and sly way of taking the courts. And then once the courts were taken, no matter what things had been passed in terms of civil rights laws, you remember you get 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, but you also have, it's a felony by 1875 to discriminate in your business based on race. But then you get an overtaking of the courts. You get two things, the attack on voting rights and the attack on the courts. Then you get a third thing that starts happening, hypersexualism. If you don't stop these black men from being in power, they're going to rape your white men. I don't have time to deal with that, but understand hypersexualism, particularly those of you that support LGBT rights as I do, understand that hypersexualism is not new in the face of changing democratic power. It's always been used as a tool of division. So they use hypersexual, and the second thing they used was police terror. red shirts and other folk would get deputized by local authorities to begin to put terror in the lives of communities to push them down. And then you get the pulling out of the troops in 1877, you get the overturning of civil rights laws, and then you get Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, only Holland dissenting, and then you get the Wilmington riots of 1898, where a Gatling gun is taken into Wilmington, and more people are killed in Wilmington, North Carolina on November 10th, 1898, than were killed per capita in New York on 9/11. 3% of the city, most of them African Americans, but whites who were working with African Americans who were also run out of Wilmington, and the black newspaper that was run by the mulatto son of the governor was burned down, and telegrams were sent all over the country. This is how we can restore, watch this, this is how we can redeem, listen to the language, this is how we can redeem the government back to the right hands of the white man. And voting power goes to virtually nothing. George White is the last African-American Congress from North Carolina in the country that had been a part of Reconstruction, put out. These ultra-conservatives don't take over D.C., they take over state houses. State houses. And they use state houses to ultimately change Washington. Sometimes we miss that. We put all the focus, we say we go to, sometimes I hear people keep saying, let's go to D.C. and make it a national issue. Historically, that's not how you made something a national issue. You didn't come to D.C., you went to Selma, you went to Birmingham, or you went state and up, not D.C. and down. Then you get the second Reconstruction. 54, Brown versus Board decision. 9 white men in black robes say no to the system of Jim Crow. Freddie Koch, the daddy of Charles and David Koch, calls for the impeachment of Earl Warren for presiding over that court. Let's remember this stuff, huh? The John Birch Society, that becomes the nemesis of Dr. King, the NAACP. He also questions Eisenhower's legitimacy, particularly because Eisenhower says funding of public education is a matter of national security, among other things, in terms of dealing with affirmative action in certain ways. But from 54 to 68, young, old, black, white, rich, poor, Southern people, black people, labor, all come together. They risk their lives, their fortune. Why? To reconstruct America. And we see a mighty reconstruction. 54, Brown. But remember now, the first real big protest and riots about the Brown decision happened in New York, not in Mississippi. But not only that, you get in 54, Social Security expanded from where President Roosevelt couldn't do it or didn't do it because he had to make compromises with Southern legislators. So in 54, they opened it up to the agrarian community and the domestic community, which by the way had prevented 50% of white women from being able to pay in the system, not just black people. And then you get affirmative action, Office on Equal Opportunity, 64 Civil Rights Act, March on Washington 63, Voting Rights Act in 65. You see, but once again, fusion politics from the bottom up, rooted in a deep moral analysis, moral constitutional analysis, is working. And then we see clever campaigns of propaganda. Don't ever forget that the year after Selma, Sheriff Clark's memoir about what had happened in Selma was called The Raping of Selma, Hypersexualism. The week after Dr. King stood in Montgomery and said how long, the Alabama state legislature passed a bill, I forget the name of it, but most of the text had to do with how it wasn't really a protest, it was just a bunch of out-of-control young people engaging in illicit sexuality. Again, using hypersexualism, connecting it with this issue of race, and using it to try to deconstruct Reconstruction. And then we get all these leaders killed. Don't ever forget the second Reconstruction, a lot of it came from death and the depression that comes out of death. My father used to tell me, he said, son, you don't know how it felt. John, Medgar, Martin, Malcolm, Viola LaRussa, James Reed, killing presidents, killing preachers, killing people. Viola Wusher was killed 1 hour after the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. 1 hour. She wasn't killed on the way. She was killed after. In other words, her death was a death because of the victory. The girls were blown up in the Birmingham church, not in the middle of the Birmingham campaign. They had been successful. And the March on Washington had been successful. But terror was used to depress the movement. Dr. King gets killed. And you remember Kevin Phillips goes to Richard Nixon and says, let me tell you how we can win. We got to figure out a way to pit certain people against others, and we specifically got to figure out a way to pit deep Southern whites and whites in the suburbs against their own best interests. And then you remember Lee Atwater exposed it all. I won't use his language all the way, but he told a story. He said what we decided was you can start out in 1954 and you can use the N-word like George Wallace, but by 68 you can't do that. So what you do, you start saying stuff like force busing, states' rights, you get abstract. You talk about cutting Texas, but what you're really talking about are it sounds like you're talking about totally economic things, but the byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites, and whites believe that blacks are the cause of their problem, and you're able to lock up the South. And without a moral constitutional analysis, you can't penetrate that mythology because it has served well for 40 years. But the election of President Obama, not President Obama per se, I'm not dismissing, but I want to make a point here. The electorate that brought President Obama to the presidency messed up the political predictability of the so-called Solid South. And even in North Carolina, they say he won North Carolina in 2008. Actually, he didn't. He lost on Election Day, but the Forward Together Moral Movement for 2 years before had fought in the South with Democrats to pass same-day registration, early voting, and Sunday voting. So that what happened was he won through same-day early voting. If it had just been a November election, he lost in 2008. But the key to it is not so much, I don't agree with all the policies, and I don't have time to go through all that, but it's the changing demographics that would open up a Florida and a North Carolina and a South Carolina that scares the out of these extremists that have sold the myth of extremism. And when they saw that electorate down south, black and white and Latinos and young people and old people and LGBT all coming together, understand, it took from 1868 to 1898, that's almost 30 years, right, to undo the first Reconstruction. It took from 54 to 68, that's 14 years. But they understood when they saw this elected, whether we understood it or not, they understood something's happening here. There's a possibility here for a political reconstruction, and we cannot even wait until the inauguration is completed. We have to deal with this because the demographics are shifting. And if they mess around and hook the demographic shift with the right moral discussion, people may get hope. And so immediately you see the attacks on the same attacks you saw that undermined the first and second Reconstruction. The courts, voting rights, any context of labor, public education, hypersexuality, all these marriage amendment laws, you see these attacks being leveled. I believe it's because they saw how powerful we are and not how weak. Remember, Pharaoh in the Bible knew when the women of Israel were about to have their baby. So in order for the babies to be born, in order for the Moses of a new history to be born, we must have midwives of emancipation, people like us who understand all these attacks being leveled are not because of our weakness. In other words, we have to learn how, I believe, to really unpack the mythology of extremism in a way that people really get it. See, that's one of the great things about the prophet. They are just plain speaking. Read the prophet, they're just plain speaking. You know, like Ezekiel said, okay, the problem is your kings are like wolves filled with rabies that keep eating the flesh of the people. I mean, that's how they talk. The prophets didn't spend all time, well, who can I not offend? Because they know that deep down somewhere we got that original sin, but there's a spark also inside of there There's a spark in that human soul. And if you can get to it and turn it on, and you know, even the Grinch's heart can grow. Remember the Grinch? The heart can grow. But you got to have the right language, and you got to have what Walter Brueggemann calls subversive hope. And hope, that's not the hope that's outside of pain. That's the hope that actually labels the pain, addresses the pain, articulates the pain, but then is able out of the pain to say there's still a better way. And so first we got to do is just stop playing with this. Let's stop Tea Party, left and right, all that little cute language we've learned for MSNBC, and other places. Let's just say, listen, America, this is what the Tea Party, Koch brother type ALEC extremism is saying to you. You want a great America? Attack public education and teachers. You want a great America? End and undermine labor rights and take away people's right to collective bargaining and have decent health care and decent salary. This will get you a great America. You really want a great America? Make sure people don't have health care. Let them figure it out on their own. Now, we, of course, who get elected are going to have the best health care. But you just make sure other people don't get it. And call anything that attempts to give it socialism. You really want a great America? Attack LGBT rights, attack women's rights, attack environmental rights. If you really want a great America, now make sure you, in a country built on immigration, you pit immigrants one against the other, and even become vicious toward their children. Now, but you got to do a few more things. If you really want a great America, cut all the taxes you can for the wealthy, and not only raise taxes on the working, but then declare you don't have money for critical investment. If you really, really, really want a great America, call the president everything but an American, refuse to pass anything, even the good stuff, just because you don't like him, fight even his wife, even fight his children, and then flame all the fires of race and class and national hatred you can. And then if you want a really, really, really great America, suppress the right to vote. Do it through redistricting, and do it through voter suppression plan. And to my friend that said, even if you create these so-called independent redistricting committees, don't ensure that they have to adhere to the issues of racial justice. Because if you have an independent commission, but they're still committed to racialized gerrymandering, it doesn't matter if they're partisan or not, because the deeper issue is race. But if you really want a great America, make sure you create apartheid voting districts. Make sure you suppress the vote. Now, if you hurt a few white folk in the meeting, that's all right. If you want a great America, you got to make sure those black and brown folk don't hook up with white people and build this new fusion coalition. And this is it. Now, if you really want a great America, after you've done all of this to pit people against each other, make sure they can get a gun quicker than they can vote. And we must begin to challenge that. First of all, we must call it what it is in very, very clear language. And then I believe not talk about it as a right issue or a left issue, but declare that that agenda is constitutionally inconsistent, it is morally indefensible, and it is economically insane. And that's what I wanted to stop by here and say. When anybody, no matter how much spiked tea they have drank, or how much lewd money they have taken, or how many voting blocks they have put up, or how many judges they bought on the court, we must, as Langston Hughes said, be determined to make America again. America that has not yet been, but will be. We've got to mobilize together. We've got to raise our moral voices together. We've got to challenge together. We've got to fight for our children together. We've got to have conferences like this that not only talk about what we do in here, but how do we take what is in here and mobilize it in the public square? How do we get the preaching and the teaching that we've heard in here out there in the public square? Dr. King said we got to have this kind of coming together. In 1961, he said, this is what he said. He said, it just might be, this is 61, 2 years before 63. He said, it just might be the only group that could form the massive, listen, reconstruction of the American society is a massive coalition of blacks, poor whites, progressive whites, working class folk, and even the recipients of welfare. This may be the only coalition that can shift America's economic architecture and make the profound changes necessary to care for all of her people. And this kind of social, moral, political strategy is born out of a serious assessment of history that we have never had any major change in this country where there was not an engaged and committed public square. So you talked about Moral Monday. I close here. Down in North Carolina, we figured out 9 years ago, Moral Monday is a part of the Forward Together Moral Monday. But we decided if we're in the middle of a possible third Reconstruction, and when we sat down and studied it, we didn't just run out in the street and start moving, because I believe that the Holy Spirit is not only deeply inspiring, but deeply intellectual. The Spirit guides you into all truth, and if you don't know the truth, you get enough scholars around you that know it. And we decided when we looked at American history, and history of the world, but particularly American history, that no great change was made unless it came from the bottom up. That the greatest fights that we have right now is not the Congress, because no congressperson gets to D.C. without going through the state legislature, because it's the state legislature that decides the district now. And so we decided that if America is going to fundamentally shift, if we're going to rebuild and repair progressive and moral ideas, if we're going to have this third Reconstruction, we needed an indigenously led, state-based, state government focused, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist. You cannot do anything in this country without having race right at the center. Race, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, transformative fusion movement. Why indigenously led? Because helicopter leadership is not going to do this. Prophets are regional, always have been about. If you read Isaiah, Jeremiah, the first verse tells you where they worked. They didn't get to work everywhere. Paul didn't stay in every place. He built leadership up there. And we've got to transform our whole model. The reason the March on Washington worked, now I wasn't born. I was born August 30th, 1963. On 28th, my mother went into labor. I said, wait a minute, hold, there's a lot of people doing something. Let's wait on this and see what happened. I'll come out next day. But what I heard was that those of you all who were there, you weren't there because somebody went to D.C. and said, come. You were there because there were 200 actions in cities around the country, people in jail, organizing going on at the local level from the bottom up. And we need state-based. Everybody wants to run. No, we need to get the media, get the agitation, get the focus inside of these state capitals. That's where the great, and by the way, Charles Koch, in a speech in 1974, told us that's what he was going to do. He did. He said, listen, he actually stole Dr. King's agenda. Remember Dr. King at the end of the March on Washington said, go back to Mississippi. He never said, come back to D.C. Think about it. He said, go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to urban center. Charles Koch in 74 said, what we're going to do is we're no longer going to invest in messianic political figures. This is it. It's in the article in the New York Times. He says, we're going to invest in building a movement from the bottom up. We're going all the way down to the school boards, the county commission. We're going to build. He said, we're not going to invest in county. We're going to invest in think tanks at the state level. We're going to invest in infrastructure and mobilizing, knowing that out of that candidates will generate. But he took the vision of Dr. King. Dr. King told us, build state movements. If you nationalize state movements, you'll change the nation. And particularly, Dr. King understood that if you build movements, if you want to change America, you must fundamentally change the South and urban centers. You must do that. And so that's why we believe in this. Secondly, we believe we must understand the connectivity between the issues, that how we build our movements. We got people in the room, the educational advocates, the healthcare advocates, and all the different advocates. And we said, what's the number one thing that if you wanted would benefit your cause? And they put it on the board. What's the major group that's inhibiting you from doing it? Every one of them listed state government and the governor. And we said, now who are the legislators that are voting against you on that? And they all listed. And then I said, now look at the board. The same people. Democrat or Republican, it was the same people. And then I asked this question, why is it that progressives can't get together? Why is it that we want to work in our silos? Is it just because of the grants? What is it? What is it? Why is it that if you know who's against you and you know where they are, if they are cynical enough to be together, why aren't we smart enough to come together? And I'm telling you, in the first year when we finally came together, there were progressive things that had been laying in the legislature with Democrats. Understand this, for years. Same-day registration, early voting had been put on for years before Democrats, and they wouldn't pass it. But when we came together, and they couldn't call the NAACP president anymore for a private meeting on certain issues. And they couldn't call labor in just for a private meeting. When we all came in together with this common agenda, in 1 year we passed what had been lingering for 15. And I can give example after example. We also recognize we need an agenda of hope, not just fear. I believe these are 5 things. I tell people I'm tired of coming to some conferences now to keep talking about what the agenda ought to be. At some point, somebody ought to figure it out. Now, I want to suggest a few things that we ought to be able to gravitate around. Number one, that if we're going to fundamentally have the kind of democracy that keeps heading toward a more progressive, more perfect union, we must have a focus on pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that ensure economic sustainability. Number 2, we must demand and fight for educational equality for every child by ensuring high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education and access to college and community college. Number 3, health care for all. We'll work and make the Affordable Care Act work, but we got to protect Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and we got to continue to push for universal health care, and we must have environmental protection in women's health. Number 4, in light of all this happening, we must fight for fairness in the criminal justice system, but we got to tweak that thing a little bit. Not only must we deal with the racial issues, but this is going to be a complex issue. We must fight for fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the inequalities that face black, brown, and disenfranchised white people. We got a quadrant, something going on in Baltimore now. Did you see who got indicted? Right. And then number 5, we must protect and expand voting rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, immigrants' rights, and the fundamental principle of equal protection under the law. And I believe if some of us began to organize around this from the state level up and say, listen, some things are not about Democrat and Republican. Some things are not even about partisan politics alone. We will name those in partisan politics, but our argument is going to be much deeper than that. Some things are too big for the limited, narrow categories of liberal versus conservative. There are some things that must be challenged because they are extreme and they are immoral, and we will use a language that allows us to do that. And then we've learned 12 steps. That when you see that, it didn't just happen easy. Number 1, you engage indigenously led leadership from the grassroots. Number 2, use moral language to frame and critique public policy through our deepest moral and constitutional lenses. Number 3, we must demonstrate a commitment to civil disobedience, even today, that follows the steps of the movement and is designed, even if you don't win the vote, it's designed to change the public conversation and conscience. It just can't be willy-nilly civil disobedience. Very planned and very key and very articulated properly. Then number 4, we must build a stage from which to lift the voices of everyday people impacted by these immoral extremist policies. You know, on the Tomorrow Monday stage, no politician can come up there of any party. The only people that can come on that stage are advocates for the issues, people impacted by the issues, and moral leaders of different faiths. Because somewhere, the people, we must have a stage that's not just dominated by the political party. We tell the politician, if you're concerned about it, you go make your stage inside the legislature and whatnot, but don't come out here for a photo op. This place is to lift up the voices and the faces of the people. Because when we put people on stage, we want to put somebody black and somebody white who's being denied Medicaid so that we can undermine the myth that when you deny Medicaid down south, you're just hurting black people or brown people. Number 5, we must build a coalition of moral leaders from all faiths. Number 6, we must intentionally diversify the movement. Number 7, we must build transformative, long-term coalition relationships, not just until the next election, not just until I win my issue and then my organization pulls out of the coalition. Number 8, we must make a serious commitment to academic and empirical analysis of policy, because I learned from my grandmother who never went to college, but she told me, boy, the worst thing you can be is loud and wrong. Number 9, we must utilize cultural and what we call movement liturgy, and the religious liturgy and music that has a way of uniting people. Number 10, we must utilize social media, coordinating with video and text and Twitter and Facebook. The guy who did that film was trained by Jerry Falwell, but he came to one of our rallies and something got a hold to him. You didn't hear what I said. The guy that did that you saw and does all of our stuff was trained at Liberty University by Jerry Falwell. But he came and heard this moral language, and it got a hold of his heart. And he said that what he had been prepared to do with other folk, he had to now put it in service to the true movement. Yeah. Number 10, we have to engage in serious voter registration education. Number 11, we must pursue a strong legal and court strategy. We must have lawyers who are movement lawyers who know how to take what we stir in the streets into the courts. And we must lift up our Constitution. We have a group of lawyers now challenging some of the extremism in North Carolina because Article 11, Section 4 of the North Carolina State Constitution says this: beneficent provision to the poor, the unfortunate, and the orphan is the first duty of a civilized and Christian state. That's a constitutional principle. Huh? We're going to use it. We're taking it to court. There's another one in there that says people are endowed with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty. Listen, Jerry, you love this. The enjoyment of the fruit of your own labor. That's in our Constitution. So we're going to challenge North Carolina's right to work law based on North Carolina's Constitution. We have found out that they scared us about this states' rights. Now, I'm not ready to give away my federal constitutional right, but those fusion coalition people, black and white, like J.W. Hood, the black Methodist preacher, and Samuel Ashton, they put some stuff in those constitutions that when the white supremacists put white supremacy back in the Constitution, they forgot to erase what was there. So in our Constitution, I'm about a state, we have a state constitution that guarantees public education. And we've used it to sue our state, Democrat and Republican. We just beat them a few weeks ago using the Constitution that guaranteed public education since 1868. We have a Constitution that guaranteed equal protection under the law before the 14th Amendment. And we've got to pick up these constitutions and dust them off and get movement lawyers that'll go to work. And then lastly, we have to resist the one moment mentality. Nobody cares about you having one big rally and a great speaker to come. They will sit right there and have lunch, drink some soda, and go right back in the legislature. So we began Moral Monday having public square meetings. Some people call it church, some people call it revival, but whatever they call it, on April 29th, this past Wednesday was 2 years ago, wasn't but 17 of us. Sister Edelman, wasn't but 17. The governor called us a distraction. He called us the same thing George Wallace said about people in Alabama, outsiders. 17. Wasn't but 7 preachers and 10 people. But you knew when I knew they had made a mistake, Dion? When they arrested one of the people who went in with us as we were challenging their policies, because in the first 50 days, they denied Medicaid, they took unemployment, they undermined earned income tax credit. And anytime you make Ronald Reagan look like a liberal who supported earned income tax credit, you're pretty extreme. And then on Monday, Thursday, even before the Shelby case, they gave the precursor that they were planning on passing the worst voter suppression law ever. And one of the senators said, as soon as the headache has been removed, talking about Section 5, we'll move forward. And we chose and said, if they're going to crucify the sick and crucify the poor, crucify the hurting, crucify children, and crucify voting rights, every crucifixion, as Billy Kyle says, must have a witness. So 17 of us went in. I didn't know we had something going when they arrested me. That wasn't. When they arrested the woman who had cerebral palsy in a wheelchair, white woman, and put her in jail because she said, I have health care, but I'm here to fight for others, and I believe what you're doing is immoral. And that picture went out everywhere. I said, uh-oh. And I want to tell you that we never called anybody for the next Moral Monday. In fact, can I be honest, we didn't even have a plan for the next Monday. We were kind of operating on the old one moment idea all too. That's why I know it doesn't work. We said we just have one good moment, you know, we can get somebody like Dion and maybe a couple of y'all to go. We at least could get the headlines. But when the people heard the right sound, when the trumpet gave the right sound, The next Monday, they showed up. And then the next, and we had to catch up. And we had to give it a name. And by the end of the summer, 1,000 people almost had been arrested. And now the judge has thrown out 900 of the cases, but then 25,000 people came. Yeah, and they said, well, they're just getting arrested. And I've even heard some of my progressive friends, they criticized us on certain, well, you got to do more than march. Well, we already knew that. We had 12 things we were doing. But we knew that until you can force a new narrative, until you can go after the consciousness, all the other things you want to do in terms of registration, you can't do it because people have no motivation. We knew exactly what was going on. But when people started seeing people that looked like them, when they saw multi-millionaire businessmen going to jail alongside labor leaders saying that they were against the anti-labor, when they saw doctors going to jail for their patients and holding the hands of their patients, when they saw wealthy people with breathing machines coming and going to jail saying, I have health insurance, but I'm concerned about the other, when they saw teachers and students and parents doing that together, when they saw straight people speaking up for gay people, when they saw white people standing up and criticizing the racism of our General Assembly, particularly as it related to voting rights. When they saw a Republican and a Democrat stand on the stage and say, listen, we are against what this legislature has done to cut unemployment. And how did they get there? They didn't get there because we recruited left and right. We recruited heart and consciousness. So what happened? Well, the governor said we were a distraction when he was at 50% in the poll. I'm here today to announce to you, after 2 years of our doing, he's now at 35% and falling. What happened? When we went in, the legislature was at 40% in the polls, and some polls say that there's now 19%. When we went in, the majority of the issues like Medicaid expansion, raising taxes for public education were like under 50%. Now 58% of North Carolinians want to raise Medicaid expansion. Over 50% say they would accept a tax hike if they know. Over 50% now disagree with taking away earned income tax credit and undermining unemployment, according to the PPP poll. We've had 1,000 clergy of all different faiths. This thing has gotten so powerful. It's not me. It blows my mind that whenever we gather sometimes, especially on Saturdays, the Jewish community will hold their Shabbat at a black Baptist school early enough so that they can carry the Torah down the street with Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and people who don't even claim to be people of faith, but who believe in the moral arc of the universe. We've had 140. We saw 100,000, even though most national media didn't report it, 100,000 people showed up in February 14, the largest gathering for social justice and civil rights in the South since Selma. Nearly 50 this past February showed up. 1,000 people arrested. We've won several cases in the court. We even won in the Fourth Circuit an injunction against all those voter laws. Now, the Supreme Court did not uphold it, but the fact is we won, because the only fights we've never won are the ones we did not fight. Now, what we understand is we got to stay together. And so this past Wednesday, I'm here tonight, since they decided, and they decided to shut down the legislature on Monday. So we just moved tomorrow Monday to Wednesday. And we announced to them that tomorrow Monday is a spirit. It's an attitude. It's subversive hope. It's what happened when the Lord gets a hold to you. It is when God moves. It's when you lean in to the better angels of your nature, as Abraham Lincoln. They don't understand that Moral Monday is a movement, and there's a power that happens when we come together. There's a power that begins to move, and all we have to do is look down through history. It looked like slavery had won, but when Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Henry Thoreau and the abolitionist Garrison came together, they beat back the lies of injustice and told the truth about justice, and slavery had to come down. When women didn't have the right to vote, the problem was they messed around and let Sojourner and Elizabeth Cady Stanton get together. Ain't I a woman? Together with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and women won the right to vote. Jim Crow looked like it was over, but they messed around and let this woman, and she wasn't all that kind and sweet, as the history books say. Go read the book, The Radical Life of Rosa Parks. And if you think that that all of a sudden she just went to jail and then they printed 50,000 flyers on a mimeograph machine overnight one night, If you think that's really how it happened, that you can roll out 50,000 flyers on one, if you don't understand that those sisters had some flyers already ready to go, if you don't understand that Rosa Parks had gone to Highlander and she had trained, if you don't understand that what really motivated Rosa Parks was a number of things, that she had investigated the rape of black women, and she had been doing it long before Dr. King ever got there, and there was a whole group of people that had been fighting. If you don't understand how E.D. Nixon came in and took over the local NAACP so that it would be more radical and not just going along to get along. And if you don't understand that there were whites and blacks that were engaged in this movement, and that Rosa Parks, when she sat down, it was more than just a notion. It wasn't just a little lady sitting down. It was time. It was time. It was Kairos time. And I believe it's time once again. And by doing that, she simply gave a platform where King could stand up and so many others could stand up and people could come in and they transformed. Don't forget, they said apartheid would never come down. But when Mandela and the other people stood together, they were able to speak truths that could tear down the lives. And when we come together in the public square, if you just try it, some strange things will happen. Like this, I always tell this story, particularly to progressive folk, when I'm talking about changing this language first. The language is the first point of liberation, because if we do it, we'll reach some people that otherwise we thought we couldn't reach. When the first set of Moral Mondays ended in the summer of July 13 in Raleigh, Leo, we decided that we needed to go on the road. So we decided we'd go to Asheville, up in the mountains, now and out west of North Carolina. Now you got to understand, western North Carolina is an interesting place. First of all, the NAACP is never really organized there. Second of all, there are not that many black people there. Third, it was a Tea Party stronghold. But we decided we would pick out Asheville because it was a little bit more progressive. Well, on the way to Asheville and planning for Asheville, I get a call from Dr. Tim Tyson. I don't know if y'all know him. He's a historian of black studies at Duke University. He's white, but his daddy was Vernon Tyson, who is the one that is lifted up in the book, Blood Done Signed My Name. That's Vernon Tyson. Well, anyway, Dr. Tyson calls me and says, Reverend Barber, we got a call to go to Mitchell County. You going? I need you to go with me. My answer to him was, are you crazy? And hung up. The reason is because I was human relations director in North Carolina. Mitchell County is way out west. Now, Mitchell County is where all the black people were run out in 1920. They were put on the train because of the alleged rape by a black man of a white woman. They were run out of Mitchell County. That area up there is paramilitary. It's 99% white, 89% Republican. I said, if they shoot me, I'm not going there to let it happen. I'd had enough trouble anyway. So his daddy called me, old man, he's about 80 years old. He said, Barber, old white Methodist preacher, he said, Barber, you gotta go. I said, Doc, he said, Barber, you've been saying that this movement is a moral movement. And if you're too comfortable with where we are, you're too comfortable. You gotta go test the message and test him. I said, but Mitchell County? He said, Doc, I'll go with you. I said, but Mitchell County? He said, I'll go with you. So I said, okay, yielded to the old man. He said he would go that next day, Sunday. I preached hard as I could just in case I didn't get back. Because in the black church, see, in the black church, you want to make sure that if you die, they put a black shawl around the chair that the pastor sits in at least a month. Because if they put it down there for one Sunday, that means they were glad that the Lord removed you and they didn't have to vote you out. So I preached real good, and I kissed my wife as his I kissed her because I didn't know. And y'all laughing, but I'm serious. I kissed her real good, and then I got a couple of singers go with me because I said, well, at least if they sing it, because, you know, some folk like to hear us sing. So I said, at least if they sing, they can kind of, you know, make it easier. And then Tim got in the car. I took my security guard, and he doesn't like me to say this, but he ain't got but one bullet. It's rusty. He might give you gangrene if he shoots you, but it ain't a whole lot. And he got in the car with me, and here we go, up the mountain. Now, when you get to Mitchell County, you turn, and it's one way in. You can't turn around. It's up the mountain. You can't turn around. You got to go all the way and then turn around. So we get there. It's about dusk dark. When the guy comes out of the church, we met at a church. He says, Reverend Barber? I said, yes, sir. He said, we're glad you're here, but understand, we're not here to talk about Republican and Democrat stuff. Now, we don't. If you start that, we're shutting the meeting down. I said, I understand. He said, we want to understand something about this movement you've been talking about. I said, yes, sir. We're fine. He says, do you know anything about this scripture? This is a scripture we're going to read at the beginning about Jesus overturning the tables in the temple. I said, sure, that was the first Moral Monday. It happened on Monday of Holy Week. I'm very familiar with that scripture. He said, now we're going to sing, blessed be the tie that bind. Now, I couldn't say, well, wait a minute now. I don't want you singing those kind of songs. You know, there may be people here that don't believe. I sing your song. And then before I got up, Dr. Tyson, the old man, said, let me say a word to you all. And he told a story about how he had to embrace his daughter when he found out his daughter was gay, to this very, very different crowd in Mitchell County. And then he said, all I want you to do is hear this young man. And so I got up with some trembling. Everybody was looking at me, kind of like y'all. They wasn't frowning, they wasn't smiling. And I just started in. I started talking about the Constitution, started talking about the scriptures, started talking about how many people in the mountains would die because of the lack of Medicaid expansion. Folk were writing it down. I didn't know that. I heard them say, I didn't know that. Started talking about how many people there needed living wage and minimum wage, how many jobs had been taken from the mountains because the corporation had moved them and without labor unions and whatnot. I just went through and how the environment, and showing them how the same people that were hurting the environment in the mountains were the same people attacking public education, and how public education jobs were being moved from the mountain because of people that they were voting for, that they had voted for because of their stance on prayer in the school and their stance on abortion and their stance on homosexuality. They used that to create this mythology in their mind, but when they went to Raleigh, they actually were voting against policies that were hurting them. And I did not ask them to be left or right. Did not ask them to be conservative or Democrat. Just asked them to take a good long look at our deepest moral center. Well, at the end of it, they clapped like this. And then one man stood up and said, Reverend Barber, the reason we've had you come up here tonight is because we've been coming tomorrow Monday, clandestine. We'd meet on Sunday and then we'd come down because we wanted to see, was it a real movement or just an adjunct arm of the Democratic Party? And we've been coming. I said, you see that man right there? That's the former chair of the Republican Party. He just resigned his chairmanship a couple of weeks ago because he's declaring he's not a Tea Party extremist Republican. He's a Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Eisenhower Republican. He's been coming down tomorrow Monday. See that lady over there? Her son was hurt bad by a preacher because he's gay. He came down tomorrow Monday and found community again and reclaimed his faith. By that time, I was just staring. Then one of them said, Reverend Barber, we got a question for you. Can we start a branch of the NAACP? Now, I'm part Pentecostal. I'm not just a congregational. So sometimes in Pentecostalism, you don't know really what to say. So I just said, you know, I just had a little glossolalia because I didn't really know. I mean, we had never imagined having a branch of the NAACP in Mitchell County. And they said, we want to start one. Now, it's going to be Republicans and Democrats in it, but we're going to be civil rights oriented and focused, and we will fight. And in less than 2 or 3 months, they had over nearly 200 members. And I'm telling you, that branch is strong, and they battle. They battle in some ways I wish others would battle. And then about 9:45, this is where it all broke loose, and I understood why moral dissent is more a necessity now than ever. They said, Reverend Bob, before you leave tonight, will you lead us on a march? And I said, march where? They said, we want to march over to the Tea Party legislator's house that we elected. And I said, wait a minute, white people. Now, let me tell y'all something. I do the branch thing, and I understand, and y'all are coming. I'm not marching at night. I said, we don't march at night. I know y'all, no, somebody else started that. I said, but I tell you what. I said, if you plan one in the daytime, I'll come back. And we all started laughing. I felt comfortable enough to say that then. I said, but tomorrow we're going to be in Asheville. And if you'll come down to Asheville, with the guy, they said, we'll be there. And we went to Asheville. And when I got up, went to bed that night, Sister Elma, I prayed to God for 500 people. I said, God, just don't let us be embarrassed. Because the media was already saying, oh, it's just a Raleigh phenomenon. It's just Chapel Hill. It's just Durham. You know, that's all this is. It's not really a movement. And about 4 o'clock, my team came and said, Reverend Bob, you got to get up. I said, what's wrong? They said, the streets are blocked. The cars are blocked. I said, what, an accident? They said, no, it's thousands of people. And I said, what? and I looked out the window, and there were 10,000 people in Asheville, and 80% of them were white, and they were black and white and Latino, and they were singing "We Shall Overcome," and the NAACP sign was up in front of it, and I know a miracle when I see one. I said, this is not William Barber, this is not any person, this is what happens when the trumpet sounds a certain sound. This is what happens when we take back the public square, and we're able to articulate a moral vision. And I know you all heard Tom Tillis won. I know y'all heard that. I know they put it in the watchbook. But tell them, go back and look. Tell them to go back and look at the fact that he won, but he only got 49% of the vote. And I'm not talking as a sore loser. I'm just talking as someone who knows how to do analysis. 51% of the people voted against him. Go back and tell him he won because in some ways the candidates the Democratic candidate put up ran from the progressive things that this administration have done rather than stood on them and did not articulate that same moral vision. Go back and tell them that he won because we can trace now all of the what am I trying to say? The votes that were suppressed and all of the ways that was done. And tell them that we're not partisan. We're not against him because he's Republican, because he's Democrat. We were against him because of the issues that he promoted that would subject voting rights and rights for children in a very regressive format. But tell them that we never had a senator in the South, in North Carolina, win by less than 1% of the vote. Tell people that he only won by 30 votes per precinct. And tell people that down in the South, we are not discouraged by one election. Because we know that when you come together, you got to be committed to walk together, children, and not get weary. Because one day, there is going to be a great getting up and the camp meeting. And that's what we are committed to do. And I believe if we do it all across this nation, particularly in the South and our urban centers, and we lift this moral agenda and show people a better way, not a Democratic way, not a Republican way, not a left way, not a right way, but a way that is constitutionally consistent and morally defensible and economically sane, that we can restore the public square. And if we do it, we will save the soul of this democracy.